So looking up the movie, we're talking about Solaris. So I think so. I'm talking. So the one I saw was definitely the George Clooney one. Sounds like you were talking about
Yeah,
the.
I didn't like the George Clooney one.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was
But
gonna play along with you and say, yeah, that was a great one, but I didn't. It was been a long time, but I don't remember being especially great. But tell us about the
no.
1972 one.
Well, the 1972 one, it's just like really plays up the strangeness of it. So the movie is based on a book. And I'm like forgetting his name right now.
You said Tartovsky, or is that the
No,
filmmaker?
the novelist.
Oh, Stanislav
Oh yeah, Stanis
Lem. Okay.
Lem Stanislav. Um, and so the premise is that there's this planet that's an ocean in outer space, and these astronauts have been studying it, and what they find is that when they try to read
Mm-hmm.
the ocean kind of reads them back.
Oh.
And then what starts to happen is that through the night, somebody who's long gone from their lives will materialize before them.
Um,
And so for the main character, the person who materializes for him in the middle of the night is his wife, who I think committed suicide.
okay.
Um, and so her reaction to being alive and her not understanding what she is or anything at all about herself is, I think, the closest thing to amnesia that
Mm,
I've encountered either in film or in fiction. So
okay.
she's, for example, she just wakes up completely materialized and then wearing this dress. And it's like very similar. Like she's just looking at this
Uh,
dress and being like, I don't know what this is. And she just
right.
doesn't have access to the memories that he has of her.
Mm-hmm.
Because she is kind of a projection of this alien ocean. So she herself doesn't know what she is.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and I think that there's some point where it's like bedtime and they're going to sleep and she has to take off this dress and she asks him to take it off and she turns around and the place where it would have been kind of like tied with the little string in the
Mm.
back. It's kind of like it has all of the kind of makings of you could untie it, but it's actually like one piece. And he
Mm.
has to take these scissors and then cut open the dress. So the glitches, you know,
Okay.
to me, like that speaks of kind of like
Oh, I see.
what the way that memory has glitches in it. And
Mm.
we tend to think that it's a very stable thing, but it just has these weird glitches in it.
Wow.
And there's a point where she sees a photograph of herself, and she says, "Who is this?" Do you know
Mm.
what I mean? So it's just like
Yeah.
so similar to actually what, for me, my experience of amnesia, um, her reaction to being alive is just the closest that and I've
Okay.
watched that movie, I think at this point, maybe 6 times. And I know that after losing my memory, maybe it was a year later when I first saw it.
Mm.
And I just had like this deep moment of recognition just watching her
Wow.
trying to understand who she is. And it's not like she has amnesia, or she does in a way, but she's more kind of like an alien projection.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I just remember just watching her and just feeling just, I don't know, just like remembering myself also, looking at this black window and then having that question of like, what am I?
Mm.
You know?
That's like what, like Russian dolls or like a hall of mirrors, right? Where you're a year or so after your accident, you're watching someone else you feel like is your experience from a year, it's just like
Yeah, yeah,
layers and layers and layers and layers. Man.
yeah.
I,
I love that movie.
oh man, I gotta check it out. Yeah, I gotta check out the original. The original's always the best, right?
Yeah.
Um, my son is 4 now, but I think of like even when he was 2 or 3 or barely talking, he would say like, "What time is it?" Which, like, what is it? I'm thinking like, what does that even mean to him? You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, what does it mean to say 4:53 when I just said 4:49 4 minutes ago? You
Mm,
know, like I'm just so interested in like, what does that even mean?
yeah, we're just
Yeah.
really so strange. It's like we are really very strange.
Right. That's for sure. That's for sure. Short and to the point, but that's some of the great wisdom you've already dropped for sure today. Oh man. So, going back to the book towards the beginning, you after the accident, I'm not sure how soon after, but like your family, especially on your mom's side, they were like, "Oh man, like let's." I don't know if it's like let's chisme out, but like let's like how is it like? Are you gonna get the gifts too, or like you've had some growing? Like how is that accident gonna affect you in the same way as it affect is it gonna affect you in the same way as it did your mom? Right? The line from the book is quote 4 decades later when I suffered my accident and lost my memory, the family was thrilled. Diaz poured
Yeah.
drinks, told one another with an air of festivity, there it goes again, the snake biting its own tail. And then they waited to see how exactly the secrets would manifest in me. um, and you write, this is a story that happens in Spanish, and you go on to describe how your mom and the tias call each other vos, like the old school like thou, but they use tú with you. And then you go into colonial fossil in Spanish, how the language has evolved and all of that. I guess going again back to language, you talk about how your mom and your grandfather, they were storytellers. They you had your little side hustle business for a while, right? Where you were doing like telling fortunes and like reading palms and that kind of
Yeah.
thing, right? And you said you weren't getting a lot of customers until your mom was like, tell them a story, like use the metaphors. How much did you appreciate that at the time? And then how much has that led to you becoming a writer? Just this idea of like creating a story, creating a background, and using metaphor.
I think that time in my life definitely was the thing that just introduced me to the power of stories. And just watching, the things that my mother would do, which when someone comes to you for aid and they're coming to you because they're in a point of crisis, whether it's mental or physical or emotional,
Mhm.
um, what they're asking is, with help, either finding a solution, so like opening a path through what's happening to them, or sometimes just even just holding their story and, trying to make that person arrive at a new place. Uh,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
and when I was giving like tarot readings and palm readings in my school, and I used to have a business and I would charge. I wouldn't charge a lot, but I was just, but there were a lot of people, so it just I was making like, money for a young person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the what I just noticed like how what it felt like to suddenly know so much about people. Because when you're giving readings, the questions that people ask say a lot about what they worry about, or say a lot about what they're kind of obsessing around.
Mm-hmm.
And I I just always knew that I wouldn't be a good fortune teller
Mm-hmm.
or just good at what my mother does at all, because my interest would be in the human element. Like
Like
I
the
would be interested in
analytical kind
like,
of like.
yeah, I would just be interested in people's lives and more of wanting to listen, um and just kind of like really wanting to kind of get involved
Mm.
in that. And I think that if you want to be, a curandero or even just a doctor or a medicine person, that you can't get 100% invested in the
Mm.
stories that you're being told, because then otherwise you start to lose your ability of being able to help anybody,
That makes sense.
because then you're just kind of carrying other people's weights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, that I think that there was something very interesting about um trying to give someone an answer via, you know pulling some cards and giving a tarot reading, or like looking at their palm and trying to give them an answer
Right.
to the thing that they were obsessing about or searching for,
Mm.
or just really wanting to know. For me, there came a point where I started to become very good, but only because I was very good at analyzing.
Sure.
So I could tell, in my school, like I could tell who had a crush on who, and I could tell who was cheating, and I just had so much information, and it all had to do with people coming to me and being like, does so and so think about me?
Mm.
And I'd be like, okay. So like when that person comes and asks me that same question about them, then I'm like, you guys like each other, you know? But I would just, give them a reading for that. At some point, I became more popular, and then the questions got harder.
Yeah.
And then it had to do about, someone telling me about um, addiction in their family, or potentially like losing their family house, and what would happen in a year. And so questions that I didn't know how to answer,
Right.
and was just not ready for it all. But it did kind of, um, I don't know, I think that the way in which I'm interested in the world, and I'm interested in what people are going through, and have a lot of empathy for that, that it makes me just more suited to storytelling,
Yeah.
to than to try to help anyone.
No doubt. You're talking about like some of the common things they would the your classmates would come to you with, like you would have just prescribed for me, like I just tell me like go see that Eternal Sunshine movie. Like I remember seeing that after like a bad breakup, and I was like, yeah, yeah, forget about that person. Like, that was like the medicine I needed at the time, to rail against. Um, in kind of again towards the beginning of the book, quote, we have a word in Spanish for the walking of the dead, desandar, which andar means to walk, right?
Mm-hmm.
To unwalk, to walk until the walking is worn thin, to walk until the walking undoes even itself. And then about ghosts and such. You talk about how your mom was a village ghost through her like recovery time, and just ideas of ghosts. And obviously
Yeah.
ghosts are a huge part of the book, right?
Yeah. And she was having dreams where
Right.
the narrative in the dreams that she was having during amnesia was that she was a ghost in a village.
So I guess the idea of like the walking and the unwalking, the idea of the ghost and like real life, you know, and there were times in the book where you wrote like I would rather, there was a great conversation, you and your mom, where you're kind of like, yeah, like nostalgia, like remember those days when we were really more enmeshed in the ghost world? That was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
I'm obviously paraphrasing, but
Yeah.
I just wonder about like that, living in the real world, living in your dreams, living with ghosts. Like, I mean, I know it's a huge question, but like how that, especially post amnesia, has really informed your life.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think, I suppose with ghosts, what I think is that we're always following the people who have left us,
Mm.
whether that's people who have passed away or people who have kind of like left our lives. There's a way in which we continue to follow them.
Mm.
Um, and I know that for my mother and myself, when we had amnesia, that it is almost like we ourselves were the ghosts.
Hmm.
We ourselves were the people who had left. Um, and there was just a certain freedom and a certain weightlessness to that, to leaving and to being a ghost,
Mm-hmm.
and being unattached, and being um having joy and having wonder,
Mm.
and just not being connected to anything or anyone. So there's a real kind of freedom, and this a real lightness and happiness that can come from that. In the end, I think for me, just that moment, right after the accident, maybe like, if I don't even know how long it would be, maybe
Mm-hmm.
like half, I don't know, like my idea of time after the accident is
Oh,
a
I bet.
little, it could be like an hour, whenever I saw the black window and I saw myself, for me, that was the moment where it just became very difficult to walk away or to just remain,
Oh, I see.
being happy, like being a ghost, leaving or just not having memory.
Hmm.
I was very committed to living my life that way at that moment. But when I saw my reflection, there was something about just realizing that I was a woman and then realizing that I was brown, um, and just realizing in some way that I was not in my land,
Mm.
that I was not like in the place that I had.
Mm.
Because I think, my initial thought was I knew that I had come from somewhere, I just didn't know where
Mm.
I had come from.
Mm.
And that idea of being unknowable to myself or having a history that isn't for some reason I can't access
Mm.
was really difficult to walk away from.
Okay.
And I think I don't know like what would have happened if I hadn't seen a reflection.
All
I
right.
feel that I was gonna walk away from my life. Like
Mm.
what I wanted to do was to find my way to the port and then get on a boat and then convince someone to take me on a boat and like I'll do whatever job. And
Mm.
then I just wanted to be in the ocean, and what I wanted was to be isolated. I just wanted to my idea of, like when I had amnesia, I was like, the fantasy of it was that I could somehow be a deckhand or something, like whatever
Mhm.
it is that people do on boats.
Yeah.
And that nobody would talk to me and that nobody would have questions about, where I came from or anything, or
Oh.
that it wouldn't matter. I could just make up whatever and I would be
Mm.
surrounded by people who didn't know me. And I would be surrounded by the ocean, which to me felt very similar to the feeling of amnesia, of just being kind of
Mm.
like in this
Right.
expanse that's very mysterious and very alien but very beautiful. So
Wow.
I wonder like what would have happened if I hadn't
Yeah.
seen myself. Like I don't
Well,
know.
I
At some point I might have remembered, but who knows? I don't know.
yeah. Do you have a lawyer ready for copyright, like suing, like for Black Mirror? Come on.
Why
The show Black Mirror?
yeah, did
Like
they do
that's your
something like that?
I don't even know much about the series, but that's your story. The Black Mirror for you was just
Oh
was
yeah.
so pivotal, right? Do you like if somebody would have told you like right after that said you're from Paraguay, would you have believed them? Just ideas of like home, like would you believe them or they talk about like Hmong people. I know parts of Mexico like this, you'll bury the umbilical cord under the family home and just ideas of like being drawn back. Like would you is there something in all of us, I guess, that like you would have known more quickly like I'm from Colombia.
I think that you could have told me that I was from South from the Middle East, and I would have been like,
Actually,
okay.
you're right about that. You're right. Yeah, you're right. Right.
Um, and I even at some point I took out when I was going through this bag that I was carrying, I saw my ID
Mm.
and I read my name. And even reading my name, it didn't seem familiar to me at all.
Mm.
Like it seemed like I was reading a name off a phone book,
Right.
So it was interesting like what came back and then what didn't.
Mm.
Um, but my own name was, yeah, it was just like, yeah, I had opened the phone book to a random page.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
just reading in a random
Yeah.
name that meant nothing to me. Um, so I think in early on in the beginning, um, the memory that made me realize that I was Colombian, or what led to that was that it was the night of the accident,
Mm.
and I had gone to back to my apartment with um my boyfriend at the time, and he had been told by the ER doctor to wake me up every hour to
Hmm.
make sure that my brain was not swelling, and the instruction was to just ask me easy questions like what is 1 plus 1, and these are not things that I knew. So when
Mm.
the doctor said, like, 1 + 1 is 2, um, and he was just kind of going through the instructions, I was memorizing that. Do you know what I mean? I was like,
Uh-huh.
1 + 1 is 2. Like, I didn't
Gotcha.
actually know
Okay,
that.
tool.
I was
Yeah.
just like
Right.
remembering what was being said. Um,
Mm.
he was like, "Oh no, you'll like ask her what year," and she's supposed to say, 2007. So there was just like things that I didn't know that I was just memorizing. But that night, one, and I guess I should back up a little bit and say that at this point in my amnesia, that I had decided that I wouldn't tell anyone that I was having amnesia.
Right.
Everybody thought that I had just been in an accident and that everything was fine, and that I wasn't having any problems with remembering things.
Mm.
So the doctor sent me back. And then he was supposed to like watch over me. But one of the questions that he asked that night was, where are you from? And I remember getting very upset because this was not part of the list of questions that the doctor had said. So I was like, this is not,
You prepared for the
studied,
test. You
I
prepared for the
studied my
test.
answers.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
wasn't one that was supposed to be in there.
Hmm.
Um, but there was this moment of feeling afraid, and just kind of feeling very kind of threatened. Um,
Mm.
and that feeling of fear is what somehow made me realize that I was Colombian.
Whoa.
Like that feeling of I'm afraid, and then somehow that being familiar, and then that opening the door into,
Wow. Oh
oh,
my
I
God.
grew up being afraid in Colombia, and then I
Mm.
could say I'm Colombian.
Wow.
Um, but until that moment, you could have told me you're from Paraguay or you're from, wherever, and I probably would have believed you,
Mm.
and it wouldn't have meant anything to me.
Sure. Well, so I mean, so ghosts are such a huge part of this book, and like what makes it so great is that, I mean, we go back to colonial times, Cristo Rey, right, versus what it used to be, like literally like a church built over, you know, indigenous, places, and talk about literal bones. Um, your grandfather, who seemed to have known when he was dying. Some people in the family said, well, why didn't he know exactly when, and didn't necessarily believe it, but that he was the one who was said to move clouds even at the funeral, right? But again, the history, the Spanish coming in, you write so well about like the erasure of indigenous, right? What is the phrase in Spanish? I know like the idea of like, what is it, en blanquearse, or like bettering the race, quote unquote, making the race more, like what is that phrase? Or what I'm talking about?
Well, that phrase would be mejorar la raza,
Okay, okay.
is, or
Right.
mejorando la raza, yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, some of the stories you tell are just, I mean, they're so matter of fact. I mean, like you said earlier, you went to go disinter your grandfather,
Yeah.
right? I mean, your grandfather tried to kill your mom as a baby, or maybe, or was thinking about it, right? Because of the fact that can you tell us about that? That was that she was,
Yeah, so he was out on this trip, and he would often go out on these annual trips that he took through Colombia, and he would visit with other curanderos, um and also see his other women that he
right,
had. And one of those times, my grandmother was pregnant with my mother, and my, out being somewhere far away, my grandfather said that he heard a ghost tell him there's a baby coming, and this baby, I mean, this is what the quote is, like, this
hmm,
baby will end everyone. And so my grandfather thought that there was something dangerous about this baby, and that this message meant that he was supposed to save other people
right,
by killing this baby. So he started to come back to Ocaña, which is where the family lived, and he was traveling by burro. And then I think he was trying to figure out what to do and also work himself up
Mm-hmm.
to potentially having to kill this baby. And he got very drunk, and he chased my grandmother, who was holding my mother as a newborn because she was born in that time exactly,
Mm.
um, with a machete. So he was just drunk chasing after her with a machete. And my grandmother just, burst into her mother's house, and her mother took, so this is my great grandmother,
Right.
took my mother, like wrapped it in this shawl, that used to belong to women in the family, and then just said a prayer and then slid the baby beneath her bed and told my grandmother, go hide near the well. And everything's gonna be okay. So then my grandfather arrived to her house, and he, like, upended everything. And he crouched down in the bed, where my mother was hidden, and just like looked straight in the direction and somehow didn't see her.
Wow.
And then just, went on a rampage, like continued on his rampage and just
Mm.
left and went somewhere else.
Wow.
Um, and so my great grandmother told my grandmother that your husband has been witched, and that there's, some witch did something to him
Right.
to do this. When he came back, it was hours later, and he seemed very confused, and he seemed to have lost time. So my mother, everyone in the family says that he was possessed
Right.
in that moment.
Right.
And my mother, I mean, the way that she tells the story is that she always brought it up with him when she wanted something that she needed or she wanted. So she was just wanting him, he would go on these annual trips, and he would always come back with these animals, which would be like parrots or monkeys, or sometimes, one time he came back with an anaconda.
Wow.
And so she was like, I want a baby tiger, you know. And he was like, obviously I can't get you a baby tiger. Like, that's not gonna happen. And her response to that would be, of course, first you try to kill me, and now this.
Mike, that sense of humor, huh?
Yeah.
So there, before your grandfather died, he met you, you met him. You don't have the memories of him, right? But I mean, there were some beautiful things he did for you, and passing on knowledge, and praying over you, and all those kind of things. There were beautiful moments with his daughter, with your mom. He was also, like, he was also the one who, like you said, I mean, routinely was cheating, right? I mean, there was women in every pueblo, it sounds like. How do you add it all up about your grandfather, about the great things that he did for many people, about the great things he did for people in your family, about the reverence he was held to, about his intelligence, about his creativity, and also, some of the negative things, especially, because of the research, formal and informal, you did. Like, how have you gotten to know your grandfather through the writing of the book?
Um, I mean, I guess I always knew all of those stories. I think inside my family, and I guess, specifically my mother, she wasn't someone who would not say something because it was uncomfortable,
Sounds like it.
you know? Um, and and everybody like knew what was happening. And the when my grandfather died, all of the aunts and uncles were talking about how they were going to announce the funeral, because they didn't want to announce it with too many days ahead of time, because then they
Right.
felt that if Nono did have other families, that they would just show up.
Hmm.
And they were like, we don't want to meet these other people.
Right.
um so yeah, so I think everybody kind of talked about it in the book. I wrote about it, just thinking about my grandmother and
Mm,
what that would have felt like for her. And I think always with when there's abuse, um, that it's important to tell the story from the victim's perspective.
right.
So I think I tried to do that.
Yeah.
And then that also, I can also afford my grandfather like his full humanity
Mm,
and say both things at the same time. You know,
sure.
I can talk about my grandmother's pain and how much he had driven her to grief and just um, you know, craziness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I can talk about how kind he was to my mother and how close my mother was to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to do that for people.
Makes sense. Thank you for that. Yeah. I mean, again, ghosts and ghosts and ghosts. I mean, towards the end of the book, you do you do the research in towns around Colombia. That book that disintegrates, and finding these names, and okay, oh, people telling you, oh, this must have meant that so and so was, the child of African descent, and a white, and a European or indigenous, and so just history and the ghosts, through the years of the war, which the people call the situation, right? Not la guerra civil, not whatever, right? Just the situation. Does that kind of just cover everything? Just the situation?
Yeah. Um, yeah, because at some point it just becomes, and I think I guess for us in Colombia, that the government has marked specific conflicts as like
Okay.
this conflict and this is that conflict and now this is a new conflict. And I think for many Colombians that it doesn't feel that way. It
Mm,
doesn't feel like something has ended and then a new thing has begun,
okay.
but it feels like there's this situation that has been happening the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say the situation, you just kind of mean the violence. You just mean the state of violence that there is. And it can mean, paramilitary violence, it can mean guerrilla violence, it can
Right.
mean state violence, um, drug traffic violence.
Mm,
Um, so I think it starts to cover everything.
yeah. Well, I think of it like how, like, in Northern Ireland they would call it the troubles, just like understatement, the situation. And then in
Mm-hmm.
the book too, it sounds like your mom and maybe other family members, and maybe you, the idea of, like, the gifts, the curanderismo, like, just called eso,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that, I mean, again, I don't think the translation is perfect. I mean, it means like that thing, right? Or that.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like, I love how it's just so simple, like eso, but like it means so much. It covers
Yeah.
so much. So kind of lastly, like, coming to more current history, like, your family had horrible situation with the situation, pardon the double there, and like, where you were you were taken, and your families were threatened, and was what forced you to move. I want to maybe finish by talking about your father and your mother. um, your father is scientific, rational. Is he like on the science side of like the oil, or is he like more of like a businessman?
Science. Yeah.
Okay, right. So he would go to the oil, Libya and this and that. And he was somebody sounds like he's not religious. He doesn't believe in, a lot of those things. It sounds like his first, or one of his first meetings with your grandfather was, but he shot at his feet. What?
Yeah. He just came to their house and just knocked on the door and just asked, after my mother, like, is she home or like I'm
uh,
here to see her or something.
uh,
And my grandfather just took the rifle that he had by the door and just raised it without saying anything. And then my dad just turned around and started to run and my grandfather was shooting at his heels.
Welcome to the family,
Yeah.
right? So I guess, with, I mean, like the yin and the yang, right? As far as the way you set up in the book, where your mom is a storyteller, your mom is more, visceral and feelings, and this means that, and symbolism, and your dad is very rational. He would tell you the stories about, like, I guess, like the beginning of the earth, or no, well, the story tell you
Yeah.
about oil, right? And how oil
Yeah,
even
like
started.
geology and
Mhm.
physics, and that's what he liked to talk about, philosophy as well.
Right. So I wonder what you felt like your parents, and I talk about them like their characters are actually, real people. I wonder if you feel like they bring to the book, like
Mm,
the yin and the yang. Am I oversimplifying
a little bit.
that?
Um, I mean, I think that's what's fascinating about my dad is that I grew up with him having so much resistance to listening to my mom or just kind of taking seriously anything that she had to say. And he's
Hmm.
just always just making fun of her. And I think I don't know, like when I see them, the part of their relationship that is the most endearing and hilarious to me is that he's always putting her down. Um, and she's just like this very loud, boisterous, very kind of joyful person.
Hmm.
And she's, super egotistical. So nobody puts her down
Uh-huh.
because she's amazing. Like I don't know who would put her down. So that's why it's funny, is just because um it doesn't happen at all to her, and it's never
She
happened.
just kind of just
It
rolls off
just
her
doesn't
shoulders.
mean
Yeah.
anything, but she thinks it's hilarious. Um he'll just be, I think at some point, I don't know if this made it into the book. I think it did. We were like hiking in out here in California with my parents. And I was just walking next to my mother, and my mother said something like, "Oh, I feel like I must have been a lion in another life. And I probably was, roaming around these hills just looking for prey." And then my dad came up and he was like, yeah, I can totally like see that. He was like, yeah, yeah, or a rock, you know. So
Mm.
he's just always trying to like bring her down in that way. And she just never, yeah, she just kind of like never, it just never affects, she just thinks it's really funny. But I think in the book, he he is, the person that is bringing this other worldview.
Right.
Um, and so I think what you have with them together is that you can really see how these worldviews kind of rub against each other. You
Yeah.
can see where they meet. You can see what they have in common. You can see the clash of them
Hmm.
together.
Hmm. The line from the book is your mom said, "I'll tell you what though, if someone ever made a real clone of me, right? It's not that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, it's that you had a copying machine," a childhood friend says to us. So you are the best of her, you are the best of your parents, with the rational, with all the above. And again, to simplify, oversimplifying your dad for sure. This book, I hope I did it justice. I had a great time speaking with you. The book
Thank
is
you.
an absolute must read. There's no way to talk about the book. You have to experience the book. And again, congratulations, a true work of art. Tell us again the publisher.
Doubleday.
Doubleday. Do you have any favorite places, let's say in San Francisco, to buy the book?
Yeah, City Lights is always my favorite.
Oh, the classic City Lights. I want to thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you, putting up with some of my long-winded questions.
Thank
And the
you
book,
so
like I
much.
said, the book, like I said, is just a work of art. I'm gonna promote it as much as I can in my small part of the world. And just a huge congratulations and thanks again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I loved this conversation.
I appreciate that.